the furnace heat of the summer of 1851, a strange pattern crept through the piney east of Texas and slipped into plantation ledgers like a shadow. 7 slaveholders, spread across 3 counties from Harrison down toward Cherokee, died within a year and a half. Every death looked natural. Every death came only weeks after each man bought the same person. And every ledger wrote the same dry phrase: sudden failure of constitution. The books closed over bodies and told themselves they were finished. But buried under those lines was a truth so unsettling the courthouse basements carried it like a bruise for decades. The man at the center of it all left no wounds, mixed no powders, broke no locks. He passed inspection, did his work, kept his head down, and yet owners who put their names on his bill of sale had a way of vanishing from their own lives. He became the figure the plantation world had never trained itself to face, a person you could buy on paper but never truly possess. His name in some entries was Samuel. In others the ink wavered. Kincaid, because the paperwork never quite agreed on his age or birthplace. That too was the point. He stepped into view at the spring cotton auction of 1850 in Marshall, Texas, where brick crept in to replace wood, and wealth built itself a courthouse with a voice that carried. Marshall sat like a hinge to the markets of New Orleans. Cotton, timber, people, everything fed the river routes and the money loops. The place was growing fat and nervous at the same time, and the railroad's promise hovered just beyond the horizon. The town's white population hovered around 2,000. 3,000 enslaved people worked the surrounding fields. A ladder of respectability kept count of who mattered. Old Texas names at the top, then fresh arrivals from Georgia and the Carolinas, then land agents and overseers, then poor whites hanging on by their fingernails, and at the base those the law called property. Into this world came Thomas Caffrey, a second-generation planter and a man who considered himself practical. 32 enslaved workers, 300 acres in cotton, timber money to plug lean seasons. Not kind, not cruel, simply careful. He tallied profit the way a bookkeeper ties a string, tight and neat. A widower, he lived with his 19-year-old daughter, Catherine. He avoided cards and whiskey, and he kept to the Methodist pews like a man who believed discipline brought down blessings. On April 14, 1850, Caffrey rode into town with $600 in banknotes to replace 2 field hands he had sold the previous fall. The selling block stood behind the courthouse in the packed dirt lot where men learned from boyhood how to test a back, a shoulder, a mouth of teeth. The auctioneer called Lot 7, male, black, about 28. Trained for field work, no visible marks, title clean from a New Orleans dealer. No paper said what the dealer left out. The man called Samuel had been sold 4 times in 2 years, and each owner had died unexpectedly. Caffrey paid $420. The bill of sale was witnessed, recorded, and shelved with 100 others like it. Samuel climbed down from the platform, followed his new owner to the wagon, and rode into the pine woods toward the Caffrey place along rutted roads that grew narrower as the day thinned out. Caffrey spoke in the perfunctory way of a man who believed in order, where the quarters were, where the tools were kept, how the days ran. Samuel answered when spoken to, kept his eyes low, and watched. What Caffrey didn't see, and what the social order trained him not to see, was the attention moving behind that lowered gaze. Samuel measured distances, took note of who came and went, heard the tones that rose and fell among the people in the quarters. He marked the gaps where enforcement slackened and the seams where it pulled taut. He learned quietly that Caffrey suffered from headaches bad enough to lay him flat. He learned that laudanum eased the pain and that Catherine mixed the doses. He learned the plantation's credit stood on wobbly legs and that another poor harvest could snap a neck not made of flesh. He worked 6 weeks without haste or show. The overseer, an old hand named Wallace Pewitt, logged him as satisfactory. The other enslaved people noticed something else. He asked questions with edges dulled down so they wouldn't cut the air. Questions that mapped routines and relationships rather than challenging them. He learned who had tried to run, who had lost the will, who caught favors, who drew punishment. On the night of June 2, 1850, Caffrey complained of a headache, and took his usual laudanum. By morning he was dead. Catherine found him, called the house servants, sent a rider to fetch Dr. Ambrose Whitfield from 20 miles out. The doctor came at a gallop, examined the body, noted fixed pupils, no marks, no odors, the calm of a man who might simply have slipped from one kind of sleep into another. He wrote what medicine in 1850 could reasonably write: sudden failure of the heart or lungs, likely aggravated by the man's history of pain. He signed the paper, accepted $5, and rode away, leaving a house that had lost its center to wobble on habit. 3 days later they buried Caffrey. The estate staggered under debt. Catherine, unmarried and pinned under the limits of the law, leaned on the family attorney, Benjamin Hargrove. He ran his finger down the columns and came to the answer everyone suspected: insolvency. 2 months after the funeral, the land, the tools, the furniture, the livestock, and, counted last but sold quickly, 32 human beings went back up on the block. Samuel had been on the Caffrey place exactly 11 weeks. The next man to bid was Robert Chandler. Bigger operation, 800 acres, 67 enslaved, imported furniture. Baptist deacon, middle-aged and convinced that the moral world lined up neatly with the profitable one. He paid $380 at the discount of an estate sale and prided himself on what he called a rational system: tidy ledgers, measured punishment, fixed rhythms, and as little rage as possible. He had read the journals, ran his place like a schedule, and believed discipline and consistency could squeeze a man's nature into obedience without too much blood. Samuel arrived on August 15, 1850, fell in with a work gang, and watched. He noticed the daily inspections, the Sunday searches after church. He learned that Chandler's digestion troubled him, and that he took calomel mercury chloride on the regular, purchased from the same Dr. Whitfield who had just signed Caffrey's death. He learned the plantation turned a profit that leaned hard on borrowed money. On September 28th after dinner, Chandler pressed on his stomach and reached, as usual, for medicine. He took his dose, went to his desk, and set his eyes on the pages that tracked his world. Hours later, his wife found him slumped over, a gray cast settling on his skin. Whitfield arrived and this time wrote with an uneasier hand. Pallor, a yellow tinge to the eyes, a basin of vomit besides the desk. The conclusion remained safely vague. Sudden organ failure worsened by chronic digestive disorder. Calomel poisoning crossed his mind, but he waved it away. After all, the man had taken it for years. He wrote the same old phrase, failure of constitution, and the Chandler estate proceeded to market. Samuel stood on the courthouse steps again, now with the odd footnote of being sold from his second consecutive estate. Whispers travel differently when you're owned. Across fields and between kitchens, from cotton gins to back porches, a quiet relay carried the pattern from mouth to mouth. 2 plantations, 2 deaths. No rope, no blade, no evidence. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe everything. The third buyer was North Carolina, born and sure of God. Daniel Hartford ran what he called a Christian plantation. Sunday services in the quarters, no Sabbath labor, an overseer to do the beating so that the owner could keep his hands ceremonially clean. He owned 93 people, 1,000 acres, and a cotton gin that processed other men's crops at a profit. He quoted scripture and charged interest. He sat in the front pew and measured grace like grain. He heard the rumors. He waved them away. Providence ruled. Business remained business. On November 12, 1850, he paid $350 and moved Samuel into the gin crew, closer to the flows of cotton and information both. Hartford visited the gin 3 days a week. He liked to be seen. He liked to count. The kitchen ran under Rachel, who had been bought as a teenager from a Louisiana estate and had learned over 12 years to measure and prepare with the precision of a woman who could not afford a mistake. She noticed when Samuel's questions began to angle toward the household. What does Mr. Hartford eat? What herbs are kept for fever? What time does he come and go? She said nothing and watched more carefully. On January 7, 1851, Hartford ate his usual breakfast. He met with a small farmer about a loan. He took his lunch. At mid-afternoon, while talking through a shipment with his overseer, his face flushed red, then purple. He grabbed for air that seemed to step back from him, reached once toward the ceiling like a man feeling for God, and fell. By the time the doctor came, he was gone. Whitfield wrote a different kind of note this time. 3 deaths in 8 months. All slaveholders. All sudden. All circling the same purchased man. Food stores clean? Staff questioned. No signs of poison or violence. He wrote the only safe line, failure of constitution, and went home with dread beating a slow drum in his chest. Samuel went back to market. The 4th buyer did not believe in coincidence. James Whitlock was Texas-born and academy-trained in Virginia. He counted himself modern. Clean books, clear hierarchies, and the habit of inspecting what he expected. When he learned that the Hartford estate was selling and that the same man had come from 3 deaths in a row, he grew fascinated. On February 3, 1851, he paid $275, a low price courtesy of rumor, and brought Samuel to what Whitlock called strict observation. No one else in the quarters. Food prepared separately, an overseer posted by the door at night. Work assignments that kept him in sight. Daily questions, which Whitlock asked with the steady stare of a man trained to read a twitch the way others read script. "You've had unfortunate luck with your previous owners," he said the first evening. Hands behind his back, 2 armed men within arm's reach. 3 men dead. Some would call that a pattern. Samuel's voice came small and flat. "Don't know nothing about that, master. Just worked where I was told." "And yet," Whitlock said, "Caffrey, Chandler, Hartford, each within weeks." He stepped in close, lowered his voice. "If anything happens to me, there will be no trial." And for 11 weeks Samuel did exactly what he was told. He hammered boards for a new barn. He fixed leaking roofs on the cabins. He kept a careful pace. He slept while the overseer stared. He ate what he was given. He gave Whitlock nothing he could hold with his fist. Whitlock instead began to come apart. He slept poorly. He searched for threats in empty rooms. He accused servants who had never given him a day of trouble. The overseer wrote in the daily log that the master seemed jumpy, like a man who hears hoofbeats when the road is empty. On April 19th, Whitlock dismissed the food taster he had recruited. An enslaved boy he decided made him look ridiculous. He ate with his family, read his numbers, and at 10 o'clock the house heard a crash. His wife found him on the floor, body convulsing, eyes rolled back, foam at the mouth. He died before anyone could help him. Whitfield called again into the same sad room, wrote the first words that looked like a crack in his own beliefs. 4th death. Less than a year, all linked to the same man. No evidence, no cause that sits still long enough to name. He wrote sudden seizure of unknown origin and shut his journal for the night. Samuel was sold again. By then, the quiet channel that ran between quarters had turned into a current. People spoke the name softly. The man who couldn't be kept. The man whose owners did not live long. The man whose hands stayed clean. The idea traveled faster than any writer. Ownership is not the same as control. The 5th buyer was named George Puett, no relation to Wallace at Caffrey's place. He ignored the pattern, or debt made him blind to it. He bought cheap. 6 weeks later, Whitfield recorded a death that looked like pneumonia with the speed of a blade. No cough the day before. No fever to flag the house. Just breath turned to stone. The 6th buyer, Nathan Cross, lasted 3 weeks and died of what the doctor called paralysis that started in his hands and walked into his chest. The 7th buyer, William Stokes, broke the pattern by doing the simplest thing and the rarest. He asked a straight question and waited for a straight answer. Stokes had come from Georgia with hopes and 17 enslaved people and his family. The land he bought in Cherokee County had already been cut too hard. Soil not kind of cotton, timber picked over. Prices were cruel. Investments crueler. He buried his wife in the spring of 1851. His grown children left for New Orleans. He coughed through the nights and knew with the quiet certainty of a man told by his own bones that his time was short. He heard rumors from Marshall about a man going for a fraction of the usual price, $65, and bought him. On the 3rd evening on that worn-out porch, Stokes poured 2 cups of real coffee and waved Samuel to the chair. No threats, no promises, no pistol laid across a knee. Just a tired man with the dust of failure on him. You've stood by 6 deaths, Stokes said, voice like dry wood. I believe you made them happen. I also believe no one can prove it. I'll die soon. Consumption if the bank doesn't get me first. I want to know how. Silence stretched. Crickets worked the edges of the night. Then Samuel spoke in a voice that set the practiced dialect aside. You really want to know? I don't have time to pretend I don't, Stokes said and smiled for the first time in months. You don't poison them, Samuel said. That's what they expect. Poison leaves a trail and a doctor can follow trails. You don't put hands on them. Marks hang men. You don't run. Running is an admission someone can point at. He looked into the dark. You make them afraid. Afraid of what? Of what's already killing them. He explained Caffrey. The headaches, the laudanum that quieted pain while reaching for the heart. He didn't touch the medicine. He touched the room. He asked gentle questions in the places where people carry talk. He let Caffrey hear his own rumor as if it had a face. Pain magnified by fear. Fear magnified by pain. A larger dose taken because the night felt too long. A heart that stopped without a struggle. Caffrey would have died in a year or 2. Samuel gave death a timetable. Chandler, he went on, kept swallowing mercury with a different name. I let him think about failure when his stomach wrenched. Pain took him to the vial. The vial took him the rest of the way. Hartford? Stokes asked. He was a pious one. Piety leaves doors open, Samuel said. I let him find them. A conversation where an enslaved man wondered if Judgment Day was gathering. A Bible turned to a passage about false prophets in chains, not addressed to him. Never to him. He found it. He worried. He read his own fears as handwriting on the wall. He died of belief grinding its own gears. Whitlock? He did the work for me, Samuel said. Some men carry a loaded spring inside them. All it takes is to breathe on it. And the others? The same principle. Every life has a weakness. I didn't put it there. I learned it. I let them feel it at the exact moment when feeling it hurt most. Stokes leaned back and coughed and laughed at the same time. You're not a murderer, he said finally. You're a mirror. Men looked at you and saw what would take them anyway. I'm a man who refused to be owned, Samuel said. Stokes watched the fields that would never pay him back, then said the one thing no one had said. I'm going to free you. Tomorrow we'll ride to Jefferson. I'll sign the papers. Whatever time I have left, I'll use it to do that. They won't let it stand, Samuel said. A free black man without papers is just a man someone will claim. Then don't stay, Stokes answered. Go where a paper matters, Mexico, the North. Somewhere the law has more hands and fewer chains. He went to bed with that plan in his mouth like a prayer and never woke up. 3 days later he died of what he knew would kill him. No mystery, no suddenness. Just the slow goodbye of lungs that stop trying. And then the part of the story that changes its shape. The unsigned will. Among the sad papers of an estate with little left to sell, the county found a document Stokes had drafted 3 days before his death. It named creditors where it had to and named Samuel where it mattered most. To be manumitted at once in Jefferson. The paper lacked witnesses. Texas law was clear. Without signatures seen and sworn, the words were wind. Sheriff Douglas Kimmel had held office since 1848 and liked things simple. A statute to lean on. A clerk to confirm and a problem with a handle. This problem had none. He had a man in his jail who fit into no form. Present at 7 deaths, guilty of none. Named free in a will that did not stand. Too dangerous to sell, too valuable not to. Kimmel did what the law's edges allowed. He locked Samuel up while he inquired. For 2 weeks he asked and listened and wrote. Whitfield told him he felt something wrong but could not put a needle through it. Widows hinted at dark patterns but produced no proof. Overseers described a man who worked, watched, asked quiet questions. Enslaved people said less, but what they did say sprang from the same well. Coincidence could only stretch so far before it tore. Legally, there was no charge to write. Morally, there was a problem the code didn't recognize. No one wanted to buy the man. No one wanted to free him. In September of 1851, an auction drew 3 speculators hoping to take him west where his reputation hadn't spread. A dealer named Thompson paid $42, less than a decent mule, and made plans to send him to San Antonio. But on the morning of the transfer, something no one alive in Marshall had seen before happened. A delegation of enslaved people, men from 7 different plantations, came to the courthouse to speak to the sheriff. The room went quiet not because of noise but because a boundary had been crossed. Kimmel could have cowed them back to the fields with the whip. Instead, he listened, perhaps because the air itself had changed. Daniel, who had worked on Chandler's place, spoke for them. He kept his eyes low and his voice steady because theater still mattered, but the words did not bend. Samuel, he said, wasn't killing anyone. He was teaching. Teaching people in chains to notice what the men who owned them chose to ignore. How sickness moves, how medicine poisons, how stress eats through a bone like water through stone. He was not making anything, Daniel said. He was naming it. He was showing them how to survive by knowing their owners better than their owners knew themselves, and how to turn that knowledge into time. The sheriff understood what that meant. The danger in front of him was not a single man who could be handcuffed and hauled. It was a way of seeing that had already left the jail, slipped into mines, and begun its quiet work. You cannot take knowledge to the gallows. You can only fear it. Kimmel did the one thing that made no sense in law and perfect sense in panic. He declared Samuel a threat to public order, not for what he had done, which the code could not pin, but for what he might enable. Rebellion of the mind. He held him without charge for 3 years, and passed the hat around the county to fund the cell. It was illegal. It was effective. It was the only solution the men in that room could stomach. Then the war came, slow to Marshall at first. Not with bayonets, but with shortages, with conscription, with paper money that bought less every month. The cotton system buckled and bent, and somewhere in Richmond, a Confederate official remembered a note about a strange prisoner in Texas who had made a science of fear. A letter arrived with the seal of the War Department and the politeness that meant force. Send the man to Richmond, it said, for consultation on matters of psychological operations. Kimmel wrote back no. Another order came that said yes. He wrote again, warning what they were asking for. Richmond answered with rank and the weight that comes with it. On March 15, 1863, soldiers signed for the prisoner and took him east. The wagons and the rails carried him through a Confederacy with its seams showing. By the time he reached Richmond in early April, the noose around the South was tightening, and the city had begun to taste siege in the dryness of its stores and the sharpness of its inflation. In that place, men with notebooks asked him to explain himself, and he did. He told them his method was patience, intimacy, and visibility. He told them it was a craft of proximity, of being inside a household as furniture and therefore as air. He told them you cannot bottle that and pour it into spies. You cannot teach an agent to live as property long enough to be unseen. What he had learned was a survival inside a specific cage. They realized too late and to their irritation that they had summoned not a weapon, but a critique. He could not be made useful to their war. He had only shown them the flaw in their world. So they released him, papers in his pocket naming him free on their authority, and warned him that if they caught him in Confederate hands again, he would be sold like a bale. On April 23, 1863, he walked out into a hungry city and disappeared into the last turning of the war. What came after in Texas was not his name, but his echo. When the fighting ended and the Freedmen's Bureau opened offices and set up desks and took statements, something curious showed itself in the records from the counties around Marshall. Newly freed men and women understood their former owners' ledgers in ways those owners had never imagined. They could not always read the ink, but they knew what the numbers meant. They knew who owed whom. They knew which mortgages squeezed which fields. They had learned the arithmetic of survival by watching the men who believed they were invisible to them. One case out of 1866 told of Isaac, who had worked on Chandler's land, standing in front of a bureau agent and reciting 5 years of yields, prices, and debts from memory because the overseer had chosen to steal his wages, and Isaac had chosen not to be cheated. The overseer paid, the agent wrote, and in the margins of those papers a pattern older than the war continued its work. The watched had been watching all along. Reconstruction brought uniforms and paperwork to Texas, and with them came a new habit, recording what had always lived in whispers. Bureau agents, hired clerks, and army officers sat behind rough desks and listened to stories, then turned those stories into statements with signatures at the bottom. In Harrison County and its neighbors, those pages began to show a pattern that could not be tied to any single man, yet felt like the wake of someone who had slipped beneath history's surface and kept swimming. Freed people arrived with the facts of other men's finances in their mouths. They knew which planters' fields were mortgaged twice over, which merchants' loans were due, which cotton factors in New Orleans had lost patience. They knew which families were strong on reputation and weak on coin, which widows still held land and which had given it to creditors in exchange for time. Sometimes they knew ledgers line by line. More often they knew what the lines meant. How one late shipment meant 3 missed payments meant a foreclosure that could be nudged forward or slowed down with the right conversation. They had learned by watching, by listening, by counting loads and hearing arguments behind doors, by measuring the distances between predictable events. That knowledge tilted negotiations in unexpected ways. A man who had been a driver on one plantation would stand at a fence and explain calmly to his former overseer why the wage offered made no sense given current cotton prices and the debt on the gin. A seamstress who had spent a decade in a kitchen would tell a widow that the food stores were low, the credit at the dry goods shop was exhausted, and that if the widow wished to harvest in time, she needed to agree to pay in kind, and to put the terms in writing witnessed. When the widow blanched and asked how the seamstress could possibly know, the answer was simple and not at all simple. We have eyes, and we use them. The paper trail is full of such reversals. One hearing from 1866 shows a freedman named Isaac laying out the Chandler Place's last 5 seasons, as if he had written the accounts himself. The boll weevils that bit into 1 year's yield, the price fluctuations downriver, the amount advanced against the next crop, the rate of interest. He spoke, the agent wrote, the overseer sputtered, and in the end the overseer paid what was owed, because Isaac had rebuilt the numbers out of memory, and everyone in the room could see the truth of the reconstruction. When the agent asked him later where he had learned to keep a ledger in his head, Isaac answered carefully. A man had passed through, he said. He showed us that to survive you first learn to see. News carried slowly into Marshall in those years, but even slow news builds. In 1868, a journalist from Philadelphia came through town collecting sketches of Reconstruction life for Northern papers. He expected the usual catalog: ruined fields, scarred veterans, angry speeches, wary calm. He found those things, but he also found something he could not quite name in his notebooks. He wrote that the freed people of Harrison County seemed unusually well versed in their former owners' affairs, more acquainted with private arrangements than one would expect of persons so lately released from bondage. He talked with several men and women who spoke, not of reading pages but of reading people. They talked about weighing patterns, listening for what a man's voice revealed on the walk back from town, measuring the speed of a master's steps when he neared the strongbox, hearing the clatter of keys in a pocket and knowing what the rhythm meant. None offered a name for the one who had taught them to treat attention like a craft, but more than once the reporter jotted a phrase that kept repeating in his interviews. A teacher came through. He didn't teach letters. He taught us to look. He heard, too, from the other side. Several former slaveholders, some clinging to their land, some already halfway to Galveston or Houston, some living in town as rent-paying shadows of their former selves, complained that the freed people knew too much. It was an odd complaint to set down in a time of upheaval and want, that the people one had claimed were incapable of thinking like adults were suddenly too skilled at understanding how the world worked. A man who refused to allow his name in print told the reporter, "We thought we controlled everything because we controlled their bodies. We never dreamed they could read us. They knew our debts, our fears. They have been watching, and we never saw them watching. Dr. Ambrose Whitfield lived through the war and the lean years that followed. He kept his journal. Habit is a kind of shelter. When he died in 1874 at 67, his notebooks were boxed and stored, and in those pages a September 1851 entry sits like a turning key. He had begun to accept, he wrote, that the deaths surrounding Samuel could not be sorted into simple categories. They were not, in the legal sense, murders. They were not, in any satisfying medical sense, coincidences. They were something else, and he found that something else harder to face because it fit too cleanly into the cracks of his world. The enslaved, he wrote, understood their enslavers more clearly than their enslavers understood themselves. Once such understanding exists, it cannot be unlearned. He did not call it justice. He did not call it vengeance. He called it a fact, and he did not know what to do with it. Elsewhere in those final pages he came closer to the point. The shock of the case, he wrote, was never the number of dead men but the dismantling of an illusion. The illusion that intelligence travels in one direction only, down from the top of the hierarchy like light from a high window. Once that window is proven false, a whole house changes shape. He did not find comfort in the thought, but he refused to lie to himself about it. Sheriff Douglas Kimmel outlasted the war in office, then lost his badge in 1867 when Reconstruction swept out county men like old furniture. He had spent 3 years rationing justification to himself for holding a man without charge. He told anyone who asked that the jailing had prevented what he called psychological rebellion. That phrase never took hold in the public mind, too abstract for a county used to rope and ordinance. But in his private papers, which his grandson later donated to the local historical society, there's a letter from 1870 that reads as if the man had split himself in two. He wrote that he locked Samuel up because he couldn't find a legal hook to hang him on, and couldn't think of any other way to keep the world arranged as it had been. Then he admitted that the arrangement was already slipping. The moment word got out that a slave had beat the system 7 times, the system itself went soft at the joints. He could jail a person. He couldn't jail the idea. The 7 widows lived on into an age they had not expected to see. When the flag changed, soldiers in blue passed through town, and the currency in the drawer no longer matched the numbers in the ledger. Some remarried and moved to more forgiving soil. Some stayed and measured their days against shrinking means. None of them ever stood in public to say out loud what they might have whispered in the rooms where grief wakes at night, that their husbands had not been victims of chance, and that the pattern had a human shape. To name it was to admit the vulnerability that lay beneath their certainty. To name it was to admit that the system they had rested on always carried the means of its own undoing. Catherine Caffrey, the daughter who found her father dead and held together the household until the auction broke it apart, left Texas behind. She married a Union officer during Reconstruction and went to Ohio, where winters bit and summers were mild and the air did not resemble the heat she had known. In 1873, she wrote a letter to a cousin back home. It slept for a century in a family trunk before a descendant donated the papers to a small archive. In that letter, Catherine's voice has the crispness of someone who has read more than she once imagined she would. She wrote that she had learned enough medicine and psychology to suspect laudanum had been killing her father long before Samuel walked onto their place. Perhaps that man simply made father see what he was already doing to himself, she wrote. Perhaps he did nothing at all except exist as a reminder. She did not argue the point. She let it rest beside her memory, and in that rest there is a kind of judgment without heat. The courthouse in Marshall still stands, though its uses have changed. The selling block is gone, and there's a different kind of traffic across the square now. A hum of commerce that would sound like music to those old ledgers, and also like an accusation. Down in the records room, pages remain. Satchels of folded paper, ink that has browned with the years, clerkly hands noting transactions with tidy strokes. Among those are the entries that chart the price of a human life named Samuel, as it dwindled from $420 to $42. They read like simple arithmetic: date, seller, buyer, mark. But behind those numbers runs a counter-ledger that no pen set down. The cost to a society of believing that ownership is the same as knowledge. As for Samuel himself, the paper world loses him after Richmond. There's a copy of a pass that says he was free as of April 23, 1863. Free by the authority of a government that would not outlive the next 2 springs. After that, his name falls silent in the places paper usually catches a person. No arrest, no fine, no death certificate that anyone has yet matched. That silence can mean many things. That he crossed lines and lived out his days under a different name. That he slipped south and found work in a city where papers mattered less than usefulness. That he died in a street or a field, and lies in an unmarked patch of ground inside a world that kept poor graves. History, which so often pretends it is a net, has more holes than threads. But his absence on paper is not the same as absence. If you stand outside the rebuilt courthouse on a bright day and let the modern sound of traffic wash past, you can still feel the shape of the lesson he left, because the lesson did not require him to survive. It only required people to remember the craft he taught. Look closely. Listen without showing it. Map the rhythms. Learn the fragility of the structures that claim to be permanent. Understand that fear is a kind of medicine people give themselves when their certainty fails, and that it can be fatal without ever staining a glass. In that way, the man who could not be kept did not merely pass through 7 plantations and leave 7 widows. He left a method that turned the plantation order inside out. Instead of assuming that power travels from top to bottom, he showed that knowledge travels in any direction it pleases and often upward, silent as smoke. He demonstrated that a cage is not the same as blindness. He proved that the institution depended on its subjects not knowing what they already knew. Years later, if you flip through the Reconstruction contracts filed in this region, you find traces of that inversion everywhere. Clauses written to protect wages, names signed by men who could now bear witness for one another, provisions that show an exact understanding of planting schedules, freight timing, and harvest risk. The documents are not sermons. They are engineering drawings for a new arrangement. And behind many of them, whether the signers knew it or not, stands the long shadow of a man who weaponized attention and turned it into time. Consider the language that closed the old ledgers. Sudden failure of Constitution. It's a neat phrase, polite as a funeral parlor. It was meant to end conversations, to plant a flag in mystery and walk away. Read it again now with what we've learned. The Constitution that failed was not merely the beat in a single chest. It was also a social constitution, an agreed-upon faith that some men were naturally suited to rule and that others were naturally suited to obey. That belief can survive steel and gunpowder. It's undone by the quiet fact of being seen clearly. Once the observed begin observing back and begin teaching others to do the same, the arrangement can no longer pretend it is inevitable. What then became of the 7 widows? Some found new husbands in new towns. Some grew old in houses that echoed. They woke sometimes to the feeling that someone had opened a door in their past and let in a draft. Maybe they told themselves each death had its own explanation. A bad heart, bad medicine, a soul called home. Maybe they were right, each in isolation. But a pattern is not a single event pulled thin. It is the thread that ties events together. And the thread in this case was a quiet man standing, where he was told to stand and asking questions in the voice of someone who should not have questions. And what of the men who signed the papers that turned people into property? They learned, if they allowed themselves to, that the arithmetic they trusted had left out a variable, awareness. You cannot total a ledger that pretends it does not exist. You cannot own attention with a bill of sale. You cannot seize insight like a barn or a plow. You can only be undone by it if you refuse to admit it is there. In the end, the story carries no simple moral, because the world it belongs to carried none. It is not a cleaner story if we make Samuel into a ghost who walks away untouched. It is not a fairer story if we make his former owners into monsters who deserved every breath they did not get. It is instead a story about how power fails when it mistakes possession for understanding. It is a story about how a human being inside a system designed to erase him can find the system's soft places and press. Not with a blade, but with knowledge. Not with poison, but with an awareness the system cannot metabolize. So picture him one last time, stepping out of a door in Richmond with a slip of paper that said he was free in a language that was already dying, and imagine him turning down a street where the market smells strong and the currency loses value by the week. Maybe he took a wagon west. Maybe he headed north and learned the taste of a river with a different name. Maybe he stayed near the battle lines and disappeared into the smoke that rose from cities like tired prayers. Wherever he went, the craft that had kept him alive needed no passport. It needed only eyes and patience and the courage to trust that a gaze can be sharper than any edge. 7 men bought him. 7 men died. The ledgers say sudden failure of constitution. The record books close. But the story does not. It keeps walking, because stories like this one do not live in paper alone. They live in practices. They live in communities that pass a lesson along in kitchens and fields, on porches and by the gates, until a generation grows up for whom that lesson is not remarkable at all. Look, learn, know where the stress lines run. Use that knowledge to survive. If you listen closely, you can hear the echo of that practice in every negotiation that followed, in every quiet victory, when someone who used to be called property named the terms and had them honored. The most frightening instrument in a cruel world was not a pistol or a knife or a vial. It was the recognition, sharpened and shared, that the people deemed incapable were already mapping the weaknesses of the world that held them. And once that recognition existed in more than one mind, once it became a way of seeing rather than a secret, you could no more put it back into a cell than you could order a season to behave. That is what remains when names fade and signatures crumble. Not certainty and not comfort, but the durable proof that knowledge can unsettle a whole design. A man who could not be owned taught people to see, they saw, and that seeing changed the shape of what came next.